Hey everyone, and welcome to the second episode of I Played, a series that's totally unscripted, so maybe a little bit more scuffed, um, but it's essentially my post-game reactions after completing a game, where I talk about my thoughts, try to break down the different aspects of the game, sort of similar to a review without the score at the end. And the game in question for today will be Cyberpunk 2077, a game most of you have probably heard of. Also, as a reminder, this video and this series is totally zero spoilers, so you don't have to worry about that. I'm very sensitive to spoilers myself, so I don't include any in these type of videos. And then I also 100% games. So it took me about 100 hours to complete the game, and that included all side content, all missions, and I even went through and did every ending as well to the game. So I have a pretty good take at the game experience holistically. In terms of covering Cyberpunk, there are 6 different things that I want to touch on over the course of the video, and feel free to skip ahead in the timestamps below if you want to just see a specific section, but those will be the technical aspects of the game, the world design, the open world itself, the story, the combat, and the RPG systems. I think most of the community at launch has focused on the technical exclusively, and that's kind of why I want to make a video about this, is because, at least for my own experience, when I was trying to find out information about the game, like, hey, is this worth buying? Pretty much the entire conversation was dominated by the technical criticisms of the game and how rushed it was in that aspect, which I think is a shame in retrospect, because after playing the game, 6 or 7 months since release, there's a lot more to discuss that I think is really interesting about the game in terms of like the game design itself and how the story is sort of presented and developed over the course of the game. And I actually think, like, as a game in the games industry, it's just super noteworthy, even outside of the technical aspects or the hype. And I feel like a lot of that nuance got missed in a lot of the discussion that I've seen online. So I wanted to sort of make my post-game reactions to it, trying to break apart some of the nuance outside of the technical aspects, because I really do think it's worth talking about. But ironically, I'm also going to start with, I think, what is the most dominant part of the conversation, which are the technical aspects, because I think most people, I can't avoid talking about it, so I may as well just get it out of the way at the beginning. So anyway, without further ado, let's dive in. Okay, so the technical aspects of Cyberpunk. I don't think it's a surprise to anybody, but this was very noticeable at my time with the game. And in particular, there were sort of 2 categories that I want to tackle with this section. The first is the just general optimization and playability from like a hardware requirement. And then there's the actual in-game like glitches or polish, because I think those are pretty significantly different conversations. So starting with the optimization part and the hardware specifications, I think this, out of everything, is actually the biggest deal for this game, because when I tried to play it at launch around Christmas time last year, I really wasn't able to play it. I had what I would consider like a decent PC. I had a 1080 and like a pretty, relevant CPU as well. And at best, like on medium and low, I could maybe get like 20 FPS, but it looked bad. It was really like buggy. I would get frame drops even below that much. It as a PC gamer, I would consider it pretty unplayable. Like, I wouldn't waste my time if that was the best experience that I could get on a game. And obviously for consoles, as some of you may have seen online, like it seemed to be much worse, emphasized by the fact that Sony removed the game from the PlayStation Store. So I think that barrier to entry alone is going to be, I think, the biggest blocker or reason why this game fails, just because not enough people can actually play it on either their PC hardware or consoles. Like, I actually don't think it's playable on console at all. So yeah, I think that's like pretty significant, and I hope that they continue to address that. I ended up upgrading my PC in between trying to play it last year towards when I played it this month. So my current setup has a 3080 GPU and a pretty cutting edge AMD. So I would consider my build in general pretty like modern, pretty cutting edge. And I would expect the game to run really well given that. And it ran okay. So on average, I got about 60 FPS, which is like good, and that was with most of the settings like maxed out or on pretty high. But it even then would drop down to like 40 a couple of times, or not a couple of times, but like every now and then, maybe like 2 or 3 times every hour, like enough to be noticeable, but like not game impacting. And there were a couple of times where I think I had a memory leak where the FPS would just slowly drop, and then I restarted the game, and then it ended up fixing it. That happened once or twice. And for context, the game took me around 100 hours to beat, so that's sort of like a general time frame. But I would consider it like a fine experience in terms of the optimization on my cutting edge system. But the fact that like I'm getting a fine experience on arguably some of the best PC specs to date is ridiculous, right? Like as a PC gamer, I expect like 100, 44 hertz, FPS and I on everything maxed out. Like to me, that's what I would expect for any game that I would be playing with this build. And the fact that I was like getting mostly a stable 60 is like fine, but like really not good. Especially since I have like a 144 hertz monitor. Like I want games to run well, and preferably over 60 FPS at all times. And the fact that like on average I maybe got about like 60, middling 50 is like not great, but at least for the purposes of playing through the game, I was able to play through the game. As for the other big aspect of the technical, it would be the glitches. Like obviously those, in terms of GIFs and pictures posted online, I think has been the most prevalent. I am playing it, like I said, around 7 months after release, so the game has had multiple relatively large patches to try to address a lot of issues. And in its current state, I would rate the game as slightly less buggy than a Bethesda game at launch. Which is to say that it's not great, but could be worse. And particularly, like, relative to the scale of what was said at release, I think it's a lot better than that. I definitely experienced glitches, whether it was like T-poses or characters walking through walls. I think the biggest issue that I experienced was there was just random loot on the ground that I frequently couldn't pick up. That was I think the most frequent bug that I ran into, which was irritating because I'm the type of player that likes to pick everything up. It was never anything it was never like a big deal, like a legendary or rare loot drop or something like that. It was mostly just random, vendor trash on the ground. But anyway, like, suffice to say, it's still not like a totally polished game. But as far as the glitches go, I would consider it pretty playable. The big flags that I would be concerned about, like that would be like, okay, this game is not good, is not like in a good state, would be that if there are quests that are incompletable, like they just bug out and you can't finish them, or they just auto fail or something like that. And I didn't happen to run into any of those, although from what I've heard online, even in the most recent build, that can happen to some people. And I think a lot of that has been patched, though, and like I said, I didn't run into any, and that's definitely something I have run into with Bethesda games. I remember in Skyrim, for example, having to open the command console to progress, quests and stuff like that. That wasn't an issue in my playthrough. Or the other big flag would be if the game just crashed. And again, like, I didn't run into any of that at all. The game didn't crash. The worst that I got was, like, presumably a memory leak, which I had to restart for, but overall, like, the glitches I thought were like pretty palatable. Definitely not a polished game, like I said. Like, there were issues, but nothing that I would nothing I would personally like complain over. It was just more like, haha, that's kind of funny, and a little more than I think I would have liked for those haha kind of funny moments, but ultimately stuff that I could live with and didn't really impact my core game experience outside of the looting bug. So take that as you will, based on what your your standards and what your tolerance is for that sort of stuff. Anyway, technical stuff aside, what I really wanted to dive into is the other aspects of the game, because like I said, I feel like those don't get covered enough in detail. So the first section I'll start with is the world design itself. Okay, so the world design is, I think, one of, if not the best aspects of the game, and something that I really feel like is not talked about enough publicly. It's incredible. It's not one of those, like, in terms of the world design, when I see people talk about it online, they say, "Oh, well, you can't like go into a random bar and like play pool or go bowling or play darts or something like that, right?" Like these immersive style systems that are common in for example, Rockstar's games, or like, "Oh, you can't go into every building," sort of thing, right? But the actual like just aesthetic of the world, and the ways that it does allow you to interact with them, even if they are scripted, I think really does a phenomenal job at actually selling the look and feel of the world. The visuals, when the game is running well, are incredible. It feels like just driving through the city. It feels like there's unique signs. There's a lot of like motion, because it is futuristic, of like ads playing, a lot of audio design around like updates to the news when you're riding in an elevator. There's a lot of verticality to the world, with the roads sort of looping on top of each other, and you going in a bunch of elevators for a bunch of story missions that give you different perspectives of like an apartment complex, or specifically in the mid game around one of the districts gives you like a whole mid-level like winding pathway of like shops and stalls. There's dips into like lower city type areas that like fit the vibe of being shady. There's like main markets and side markets and back alley markets. Like the actual just flow of the world is incredible. And as someone that really values like an immersive world that feels alive, it 100% nails that. I actually think better than any other game I've played, and I play a lot of open world games. I think the world design, when it is at its weakest, is when it's sparse. So particularly, there's pockets at the edges of the map, or there's this one section that has a lot of quests focused on more of like the outdoorsy open space aspect of the world to give it a comparison to the like lively city. And I think those are just boring because there's just not enough stuff there. And every time I was questing over in those like more sparsely populated, like desert-esque aesthetic zone, I was just like, whatever, this is fine. Like, I just want to go back to the city and explore it. It reminds me a lot of, I want to say, oh god, I hope I remember the name, but I think it's Novigrad in Witcher 3, like the big city. It's like if that city was just blown up to scale and like that was Night City. There's so many different aesthetically different like aspects to the city. So there's very much like an Eastern inspired section called Japantown. There's more of like a suburbs slash like Oakland-esque style zone. And then there's like the main corporate central, which has like the, you know, the fancy CEOs, very like wealthy area, very clean cut. Reminded me a lot of like Silicon Valley style in terms of like not only the housing, but then also as you go deeper into the city, like downtown Los Angeles or something like that. And then you even have sections that are like Beverly Hills, where you have like these like rich, fancy mountains in the hills. And all of it just works really well, but particularly the city is incredible. Like I found there's a fast travel system in the game, and I found just driving around, just sprinting around and like exploring was just inherently rewarding because it was just a feast for the eyes. Like the audio visual design is just phenomenal. And I just wanted to walk around in the world and just take in the sights and sounds because it was so impressive. So I really think that the fact that like most people won't be able to get to experience that because of the technical limitations, because presumably to really sell the feel you have to crank everything up, is a shame. Because there's just so much care in the world, even, you know, from the different cars and like, you know, how the different doors open, or you spend a lot of time driving as well. So like just the view from the first person mode in the car, seeing like, you know, flashing lights and, you know, cool archways and, you know, beach areas. And it's just so good. I honestly can't speak highly enough of it. And it makes me sad that more time isn't spent in the deeper city areas, or more story isn't used to utilize this immersive sections, which I'll get to later in some of my other areas. But suffice it to say, the world design is incredible, and it just makes me wish that they had more time to flesh it out. because it's just so gorgeous to like walk through and experience, even if there isn't a lot to do outside of the stories, which I think is a fair critique. But really, for me, I would have liked to see more actual story missions, letting you experience the actual flavor of the city, and that's what most of them do. But that's sort of, if I could make one ask in this area, that's what I would ask for, is more story missions that sell the immersive aspects of the city. Okay, so that's the actual world design and my thoughts on the aesthetics of it. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is the actual open world itself, which may sound like the exact same category, but in my mind is very different, because when I talk about the open world, I'm referencing it at more a mechanical level in terms of like what is there to do in the world. And I touched on this a little bit, but particularly the mission design is what I wanted to focus on here, because there's essentially 3 different types of missions that populate the world and help flesh out the actual aesthetic design of the space. The first is your main story missions, and I think a lot of side quests also I would count as like equal quality to main story, which is true in The Witcher 3, and one of the reasons why I really like The Witcher 3. But these are like very scripted, have a lot of dialogue, a combination of like immersive moments in combat, generally multi-part quests, involving like either familiar faces or, you know, really like interesting characters, and a lot of the one-off missions. And those are incredible. Those are absolutely phenomenal missions, and I'll get to those a little bit in the story section. But the other 2 are, I think, where the game fails. And I'm going to be super, self-absorbed here and say it falls victim to the open world problem, which you can hear me talk more about in my other video. But in terms of what that means in the game, the other 2 mission types, one is sort of like a slice of story, but much less attention given to it. So essentially you get like a text message or an email being like, hey, here's the context for what I need you to do in this like one area. It's a one-off mission. You go into the area, do the thing, and 90% of the time involves either sneaking in there or killing all of the guys in this one section of the map. You do a thing, which is either, kill the leader of the gang in the area, steal a car, download something from their computer, right? Like one of those things. And then you're out of there, and then the mission completes, and the mission giver goes, hey, good job, you did the mission. And I don't like these. There's a lot of them in the game. I think they're just referred to as gigs. They're okay in that, like, if you read all of the, data logs on the floor and you read the narrative text going into the mission, occasionally there's a couple cool moments where it's like, if you pay attention, it will reward you, or it'll give you some creative option that you didn't see. But like 90% of the time, you could literally just run in there, hold down the left trigger, and just like shoot everyone, and then it'd be like, good job, you did it. And ultimately, like, they're just play spaces that are created to be like surface the actual mechanics of the gameplay, and they're just not really worth the player's time, in my opinion, because they just tend to blend together too much. And this problem is most exasperated in the 3rd type of mission design, which are called like police alerts or something, and they're even less. It's just like, hey, there's like 6 enemies in an area that's very small, a lot less handcrafted. So instead of being like a building or a parking lot or some sort of multi-story like mini base, it's just like, hey, this is an alleyway and there's like 6 enemies, go kill them. You kill them and you loot the corpses of the enemies, and then there'll be like one single text log that you can read to give you context on what's happening, and then it'll say mission complete. And these are awful. So in terms of the context for all of this in the open world problem, like, I would say that 2 and 3 exist purely to just provide the player stuff to do in the world. I think obviously number 3 should be taken out entirely because they're just a waste of the player's time. They just don't really add anything other than just like, hey, there's something to do for you in this area if you want to just look at this area, or like grind XP. And then the second type are like fine, but there's a lot of them. There is so many of these missions, it's just not worth it. Like, if there was half as many, I'd probably feel much better about it. But it really feels like there's 100 of these things. it's just it loses the what makes it special, or like what could make it interesting, very quickly because of how similar they are, and the vast majority of them just don't feel that special. There are a couple handcrafted ones, but it's just really not worth the player's time. So yeah, it's a shame because, you know, when I look at The Witcher, which I'm comparing it a lot because it's the same studio, right? There was side quests, but those were much more in line with the story quality missions. And again, this game does have them, and I would consider them like the number one option that I talked about in the list of 3 things. And the second and third are much more akin to just the question marks on the Witcher map. But it's way more noticeable, I think, in Cyberpunk than it is for The Witcher. And I don't know why that is, because they're actually pretty similar in terms of like what there is to do there, but for whatever reason it just felt way more repetitive in Cyberpunk, which is a shame. And I think that is just because of how similarly and how copy paste it feels. Like you can just recognize instantly what you're supposed to do here, with at least with The Witcher you're like, well, what'll I find here? Like maybe it'll be something cool, but you just know because of how similar they are and because it's marked on the map ahead of time, like what is there. So yeah, now that I think about it, those probably the reasons. But anyway, it's a real shame because I honestly think you should just remove the third part of the third thing on the list, right? Those police missions, and remove at least half, if not more, of the gigs or the second mission type, which would significantly reduce the hours played, but I think would make the experience better off holistically. Okay, so that's the open world aspects of it. Now I want to talk a little bit about the story. And as a reminder, this is a no spoiler version of it, so I'm going to keep it like super, super broad. But the story, along with the world design, is I think what really stands out here. The story is short. There really are not that many missions. Like I think you could probably blow through all of the main story missions in like 20 hours or less, which is crazy to me. Having put 100 hours into the game, I was like, whoa, I wish I had way more story missions than that, because it just... For 2 reasons. One is it does feel short, but 2 is the quality of these story missions are phenomenal. Phenomenal. I think they're actually some of the best in the industry. They just do such a good job at taking their time. I think in a lot of action games, they like rush you to like really like push you towards the coolest segments, but like the pacing on these is really well done. They'll build a lot of tension, and there's a lot of like narrative before and after each like action section of these that really works because the world design is so beautiful. So it'll be like riding in a car, talking to someone. It'll be like, you know, sitting at a stall and talking about it, walking through the city and talking about it. And it really does wonders. Like just because it looks so good and the writing is so natural, it's so authentic, it just sells it super, super well. And I actually wish there was just more quiet moments like that. Like when I look at my favorite parts of the game, the action was like fine. And I'll get into the combat in the next section to talk about the action stuff. But like those quiet moments where you're just talking with people in the city, it's like super zen, and it's just super engaging, and it just feels super like I want to spend more time in this futuristic world that's been given so much care and attention, just talking to the people to learn about their problems and to just like, you know, shoot the shit sort of thing, right? Like those were my favorite moments, was these quiet, just like narrative moments. And that said, the actual actions sections are also pretty well done too. Those spikes in the story were also really high quality. A lot of them have a lot of tension because of how cool they are. And again, you know, speaking super broadly, but there's just a couple of sections even early on where it's just like, oh my God, I'm actually having so much fun because of the context of what this thing is. And it works really, really well. So yeah, it's sort of like the complaint is that there isn't enough of it. And you know, I don't want to sound like a broken record, because if you've seen the open world problem video, then you know exactly my stance on this, but I just want them to cut all of that filler that encourages the player to explore the like broadness of the world in favor of like more focused stuff. And I think this is why people who've played it, you'll see often, or at least I've seen often, that they're excited for the DLC, because the actual core fundamentals of the game around the world that they've built and their ability to tell a story is so good. And it's why I love The Witcher. The Witcher 3 is my favorite game of all time, and it's because of their ability, CD Projekt's ability to tell a story and to like have really narratively driven moments that just work better than any game. Like it just is compelling. I don't know how else to put it, right? Like when I play other RPGs, the dialogue can feel stilted or boring or predictable, or the stakes aren't right, or the characters aren't interesting, but like CD Projekt just nails it. Their characters are interesting, the world is interesting, the dialogue is well written, and it's just moment to moment really, really engaging. And I just wish I had more of that to dive into out of the 100 hours that I played of the game. Okay, enough praising. Now to get back on the on a more muted or neutral topic, which is the combat. And similarly to The Witcher, I would say the combat is serviceable, right? Like the game, you don't play the game for the combat. There's really, I would say, two different ways. Well, okay, three different ways to play the game. One is a stealth version, and I don't think the stealth does anything, particularly compelling. It's similar to like Deus Ex, if you want to just create a parallel where you just like crouch down, walk around, choke a guy, throw him in a dumpster, hide the body, and like that's it. Like you can also like walk around with a pistol with a silencer and like headshot some fools if you want to do it lethally, but functionally it plays very similarly. As for the gunplay, I thought it was like fun. Like I actually had more fun with the combat, I think, in Cyberpunk than The Witcher. It's just like fine though. Like it's not really like a high scale action game. It's more, it is an RPG, so it's very stats based. But like, you pull the trigger and it hits people and it like feels satisfying enough. I ended up messing around with some of the smart weapons too, which are weapons that allow you to automatically, like, essentially the bullets are homing at that point, which like completely trivializes, I think, the difficulty. Which would be like the second way to play it, right? A very gun focused, and like, yeah, it's fine. They feel punchy enough, but it's not, it's not gonna win any like crazy awards for the combat. And then the last way to play it would be like a melee build. There's katanas or like arm blades and stuff like that, where you can just sprint at fools and like slash them and stuff. And again, like it feels fine. Like it's one of those things that I think for all three of the play styles, but particularly the non-stealth ones, it feels like really fun at first, or if you're especially overpowered, like as a power fantasy. But I don't think it's particularly fun outside of that. I guess there's one other section too that I forgot to mention, which is hacking. You can use hacks to do damage or create interesting scenarios and stuff. But there's just so much combat across the game, like so many different combat scenarios. Like I found I went for the path of least resistance, which is just putting all my skill points into doing damage with guns and just holding the trigger, right? Like the actual reward of doing creative solutions is like very much a novelty thing at first, and I just don't think it like it becomes a highlight, more than like halfway in the game. I would say like it doesn't like wear super thin, like it's still fine, but it definitely feels like, okay, cool, I'm just doing this to get to the good parts of the game, which are either the story moments exploring more of the world, or it's one of those like, cool, this is fun, this combat is fun because of the context of the mission, not because of the systems itself. Which brings me to our last point, which is the RPG systems. The best way that I describe the RPG systems is they're just, like, not great. There's a talent tree, which has, like, a bunch of different ways that you can spec your character. There's, I think, like, 6 different main sections or specialties for the character. Some of it's hacking, some of it's gunplay, some of it is, like, running super fast or something like that, right? But a lot of the actual talent points are like what I would describe as like bad talent design. Like it reminds me of like vanilla WoW or something, where it's like you get 1% more damage per point sort of thing, right? Like most of it actually doesn't fundamentally change the gameplay. There are a couple of talents like that for sure, but most of it is pretty underwhelming and like really didn't make the combat that much fun or less fun for me. And a lot of it is like RPG system stuff too, where it's like, oh, well, if only you put one more point in this thing, you could, interact with the world, open this window or hack this computer for money, or get this character dialogue that would like speak to your, because your character is like has this many points in intelligence, they can give an intelligent answer or something like that. But the dialogue choices in particular felt like pretty inconsequential. There was really only one dialogue choice throughout the entire game that felt like, oh man, if I actually put a couple of more points in here, I could have solved this problem very differently. And most of it is just world navigation, where it's like, okay, cool, well, I didn't have enough strength, but I have enough intelligence, so I can get through the same exact space just in a slightly aesthetically different way. Instead of going through the window, I'll open the door. And then the last aspect of the RPG system that I wanted to touch on is crafting. There's a whole crafting like specialty that I even spec'd into. And it just feels like a waste. Like, I don't know why AAA games feel the need to have crafting systems. It just feels like it's just bloat. I used it obviously because I put points into it. But it's just like, okay, do you want your purple weapon to turn into a legendary, which is the same thing but with more stats? Do you want to be able to disassemble things into parts instead of selling them for money? Parts allow you, and then you could have like 70 thingamabobs to make like a different gun that you probably could have found elsewhere that's like maybe not that special. It's just like, it just feels like crafting exists purely to balance out character builds in the event that they feel super underpowered with the weapons that they currently have, or to like upgrade their favorite weapon. That's what I used it for, was like I had a weapon that I really liked that felt super OP, so I just continued to pour crafting components into it to just like keep it at my level and stuff like that. So I don't know, that it's just, it feels like such a complex mess, because there's even like crafting recipes and stuff like that just feels like bloat. Like, I feel like it just doesn't add anything to the game. Other than to just balance out the other systems, which are inherent with like RPGs around like, loot quality for clothing and guns. So I don't know. It's fine, but I mean, I would describe it as like very similar to, I guess, like Fallout 4, where it's like it's an RPG. Yes, you do have choices, but like they're really not adding a lot. As opposed to like, Fallout New Vegas or something, where it's like, whoa, I am playing a totally different character because of the points allocation, and like what my choices really matter in terms of how my character is played in the story and in the world. It really feels like it's just like an aesthetic over, like the fact that it's an RPG is an aesthetic overlay to the game, as opposed to like a fundamental, way to engage with the game. So it's fine. But it ultimately means that the game, I think, is much more of an action game than it is an RPG, which is kind of sad for me personally, because I wish it was more of an RPG, considering how compelling the story is, and the story moments. So yeah, those sort of an overview of the different aspects of the game. It's funny because I specifically made this video with the intent that I didn't want to spend a lot of time on the technical section, and it feels like I spent what is the most time on that section, just because of the like level of specific examples that I had to list to like help share my thoughts on that. But really what I wanted to say was like, yes, the technical aspects are a thing. Like, should we flame CD Projekt for brushing out the game? Like, of course, right? But it's just one of those things where it's like that overshadows the fact that like there are deeper problems with the game, and the open world problem, and so much filler content from like a game design choice that I think it just feels like every open world game, or it feels like the developers of open world games feel like forced to add, just like because they made the world too big and had to put stuff in it, or to like pad out the number of hours for people who are just looking to like waste time, which is a shame, because like I didn't get that feeling as much in The Witcher 3, but it really feels like they've taken a step back as a studio in that regard and just added it for the sake of adding it, which is super disappointing. But then too, also because the world design, like aesthetically, the actual story missions are, and I hope this was clear in those sections, some of the best in the industry. Like, I just think that's purely true. And it's a shame that the actual story missions are short, because I think there's some like really good stuff there. So in terms of like closing thoughts, like if the game does get more optimized, if you are able to play it on higher settings, or have a beastly rig, like I would play it for sure. just like for how interesting a game it is, if not for the controversy, if for I think the things that I highlighted that are I think like pretty cutting edge from a game design perspective. Like the things that this game does well, I think are just better than any other game out on the market, and I think it's like it's worth paying attention to. And it doesn't excuse, I think, the things that are bad about the game, because there's a lot that's either mediocre or bad. But the things that it does well are super noteworthy, and it's a shame that those are gonna get buried because the developers weren't able to finish fleshing out the different aspects. But then again, like I said, at the same time, that doesn't necessarily excuse, I think, the other thing that gets overshadowed here, which is just that a lot of their systems design, I think, is serviceable, right? Or in many cases, just bloat. So it's a shame, because I feel like they were, with The Witcher, like cutting edge, right? They were the example that other studios wanted to aspire to, and I think they sort of lost focus, or grew too fast, or it was a result of rushing the game out. But I think they sort of lost what made their studio so special, and it's clearly there, right? It's clearly there in the world design and the story, but a lot of the auxiliary systems, through the optional missions, or the majority of content that I think makes up the game, right? Like we're talking about, out of 100 hours, like 60 of them is this fluff / bloat, right? It's just a shame that was how they decided to tackle the game, and I do wonder if that was from as a result of pressure from trying to get the game out there and just to fill the open world. And it's just, all in all, to me, super disappointing, because you can clearly see there's such a nugget of incredible game here, but it's just buried in bloat of content, a bloat of systems that are like serviceable, that just were not given enough time to really flourish or really like make a mark in the industry. And then also just marred by technical aspects that were just rushed, and and the game really felt unfinished in that way. So it's a shame, but hopefully that's a more nuanced take than I think a lot of people have seen, or at least I've experienced in trying to learn more about what this game is. And I think particularly now that it's been a while since the game is out, like I like the idea of like doing a more calm, reflective look at it now that it's had a little bit of time for the developers to address some of the problems, and a lot of the anti-hype to the rage to die out. So yeah, if anyone's played the game, let me know what you think in the comments. I would love to hear other perspectives. But yeah, that's sort of my take on Cyberpunk. So thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.